Hello, and welcome to this segment of Arts Talk. I'm Sherri Burr, and I'm very pleased and honored to have as our guest Chester Nez, who was one of the original Code Talkers and the only one to pen a memoir. And this memoir has just come out. It's called Code Talker. It also is written with Judith Avila, and it's my pleasure to welcome both Judith and Chester to the show. Thank you for being here. Okay, so why don't we start with you're telling us a little bit about how the book came about.
All right, I'll start with that one,
Okay.
since I kind of drove the project. A friend of a friend who was a writer sent an email out to his critique group saying, I met this fascinating guy, he's a code talker. No one in his critique group was particularly interested in meeting Chester, and so a friend of mine who happened to be one of his critique members forwarded that to me and said, he met this great guy who's a code talker, do you want to meet him? And I said, yeah, I do. So we went to lunch, we talked for a couple of hours, and I said to Chester, you probably are thinking I want to write an article, but your story is far too fascinating and too extensive to hold in the pages of an article. Think about it, please let me know whether I can write your life story. And Chester called the next day and said, fine. So
That's great. So Chester, when Judith contacted you, what was your thoughts about having your story told as a book?
It's kind of a great honor for me to have a book written about. I really enjoyed reading the book, and it tells the story how the code talker went through World War II. And it's very interesting stories. There's some of the people that were involved in the book. And it's a wonderful story. I think it's for everybody to read and learn about what happened during World War II. I spent 4 years in the Marine Corps. After we developed a code from A to Z, an alphabet, that tells a story about how the code was developed. Most of the stories that were used is something like from A to Z, a different name from animals to different kinds of birds, different kinds of fish, something like that. And I know that the people that read the book will really enjoy the story.
Yes.
I think that's one of the wonderful things that the people decided a story about the code talkers during World War II. And I myself think that this book has a lot to do with what we went through and what we did. It's very interesting to read this book, The Code Talker Story. It's a wonderful, wonderful story.
That it is.
Thank you.
It is. And one of my students who's here, Larissa Breen, read your book and enjoyed it, and she prepared a summary for the class. And so I'd like to ask her to ask you a question about the book. Larissa?
Hi, Chester. My name is Larissa Breen, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book, and I'm so glad you're here with us today. My question to you is, you talk in the book about the Navajo tradition of being a warrior and what that meant to you, and also about being a high schooler and experiencing, hearing about Pearl Harbor for the first time. So my question to you is, how did your Navajo traditions and beliefs affect your decision to join the Marine Corps?
They were very happy when the Marine Corps came on the reservation. We're looking for some young men to join the Marine Corps. I don't know how many, some of these code talkers are still living. Out of my group, the original 29 were the first Navajo code talkers that developed a code, and that's what we used against the Japanese. It's very interesting to know and to read about the code talkers. I really enjoyed being one of the original, the first 29 that developed the code and went through World War II, 1942 to 1945. It's a very interesting story.
One of the wonderful things about this book is that you also tell us about Chester's childhood, growing up on the reservation, how difficult it was to live in the checkerboard part of the reservation, how even today there are still parts of the checkerboard reservation that do not have electricity, and that Chester went to boarding school and the difficulties of that experience as well. So when you were doing the process, the interview process, Judith, can you just tell us about how you decided to keep the focus, one, on his experiences in World War II, and second, on his experiences growing up as a Navajo?
Yes, I felt that Chester's experiences growing up were experiences that gave him a great deal of strength. All of the difficulties that he had to overcome, and some of them were huge, strengthened him, and also strengthened his determination and resolve and his ability to think under pressure. Boarding school was especially difficult because the kids were punished whenever they gave a wrong answer to a question, and not just reprimanded, but punished physically, kicked, hit. So Chester's early upbringing made him a tough, strong individual, and made him the kind of man who could become a code talker.
Right.
So I thought it was crucial that I include that.
Yes. And Chester, when you talk about the recruiters coming to the Navajo reservation, was it a surprise to you because as a student you were punished for speaking Navajo in school, and yet here the U.S. government was recruiting you in order to develop a code based on the Navajo language?
I'll give one caveat before I ask. They never knew until months after they were recruited what their assignment would be.
Oh.
So when they first came for them, they didn't know, but I'll ask him how he felt about his assignment once he knew what it was.
Okay.
How did you feel about using the Navajo language for the code after you've been punished in boarding school for speaking Navajo?
I don't know, it's just very funny. When I went to grade school, they forbid us talking our own language. And that's, I never did really like what they told us. And that's what we use, is our own native language to develop a code from alphabet from A to Z. I personally, I didn't appreciate what they told us about our language. And I think that's one of the most important things that we develop a code in our own native language. And we went through using our own native language to use against the Japanese.
Yeah.
I really do appreciate what happened.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. I think one of the wonderful things about this book is that you include the actual code as an appendix. So it lets people who have always wondered about what the code was like to get a sense of how it came about. And one of the beauties of the code is that it's not a literal translation of Navajo to English, because you point out that the Japanese captured some Navajos and they asked them to interpret what the code talkers were saying, and even though they understood Navajo, they could not interpret what was being said.
Exactly. Yeah, the code was doubly encrypted. The alphabet was doubly encrypted, and really more than doubly encrypted eventually. What they did is they chose an English word for each letter of the alphabet. A for ant, A was ant, B was bear, C was cat, and so on. Then they translated the English word into Navajo. So there was nothing in the spelling of the Navajo that suggested the letter they were representing. Ant was Wolachi, bear was Shush, and cat was Mwasi. And I know I'm pronouncing these wrong. Sorry, I'll apologize for my Navajo. But it was doubly encrypted and made it quite difficult to translate, impossible in fact to translate. And later code talkers added more words to indicate the letters of the alphabet. So for the frequently used letters, there were 3 words for each frequently used letter. And then many words were represented that they didn't want to have to spell out because they'd be using them frequently. Words for things like fighter plane or submarine. And so they used animals in their own experience, animals they knew about or had seen on the reservation, or animals maybe they'd read about. Submarine became shark, which was callow. And the fighter planes were hummingbirds, which I cannot begin to pronounce the word, but there was a logical connection between the animal and what it represented. And they ended up with 700 some words altogether. Quite a lot to memorize and to be able to decode in your head as you heard it, and to immediately give responses without having to stop and think.
Wow.
It was quite a task.
Yes, I'll say. And it was interesting. One of the things that you bring out in the book, too, is that at the time that Chester and the other Navajos were recruited to join the cause in World War II, they could not even vote. So they were missing some of the basic civil liberties in the United States. And yet, the code talkers became part of the most important part of the teams that were sent to various stations. They had to very carefully guard them.
That's true. These young men, even though they couldn't vote, they loved their country and their people. And as warriors, that's the warrior tradition. You protect the land and the people you love. So they didn't hesitate to volunteer for the Marines. And there was something more to your question, and I've forgotten now what it was.
It's okay. Just the idea of the protection they received when they were assigned to teams.
Yes, the Marines realized how crucial they were to the war effort. We were actually losing to the Japanese before the code talkers joined the effort. The Japanese would decode every message we sent, and frequently they'd arrive at a rendezvous point before the American soldiers even got there.
Wow.
So this code was huge, and the Marines provided bodyguards for the code talkers, and they also never sent them in the first wave of attack. When they went onto an island and invaded, they would be in maybe the 3rd wave. So there would be some soldiers and Marines already on shore to help protect them when they came on shore.
Wow.
Yeah.
An amazing story. Larissa, do you have another question?
At one point in the book, you talk about, in turn, having to teach new recruits the code. What was it like for the student to become the teacher and having to teach younger recruits how to use the code?
The guy that I served with for 4 years as my partner, he's a very interesting man to know. I stayed with this guy for 4 years, talking our code. He was a wonderful man to serve with, and he's from Tuba City. I don't know whether he's still alive or he's gone, I don't know. But I really do appreciate the way he took part, talking code and stuff like that. But I sure like to see that guy again. This fellow that I served with, he was a very interesting man. The first time we hit an island on Guadalcanal, he was very undecided about his way of life, whether he's going to die or whether he's going to come through. But the way he carried himself on through the war was very interesting, very helpful man. I sure like to see him again if he's still around.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chester. And you never know, he might see this interview on YouTube and contact you.
You might.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Yeah, oh, this is such an incredible story. And one thing that you capture in pictures is when Chester received the Congressional Medal of Honor from President George W. Bush. And I heard from our dean, who was in the audience at the time, that when Chester saw President Bush, he went to salute him, and President Bush thought he was giving him a hug. So President Bush went to hug Chester, and then Chester backed up and gave him a salute.
Meeting President Bush in person, saluting him, and him saluting me back, I thought it was very interesting to meet the President of the United States. And I told a lot of my friends about what I went through in Washington, D.C. He's a very interesting man, that President Bush. It's a wonderful thing that I went through something like that, which I thought I would never go through. But it's very interesting to meet the president.
Good. Yes, and I'm sure he felt it was an honor to meet you, Chester, and your fellow code talkers who had such a vital role to play in the U.S. winning the war in the Pacific. Let's see, for our audience, if someone else has a question. Larissa or another student? Is there another student who has a question?
I'll ask the question that I think was in anybody who read the books back of their mind. But what was it like to have to translate the code, to practice the code in the middle of an incredibly highly stressful situation, such as in battle, when there are bullets flying by your head and you're just trying to survive, let alone carry out such an intricate mission?
It's a very, very funny story about being a code talker when the Japanese are shooting at you. I was pretty lucky to go through the war. It's a really, really something that what you would call a scary situation. And bullets flying everywhere, bombs coming down, hand grenades thrown at you. It's a very, very interesting to come through something like that. I thought World War II is something that I have learned to try and remember a lot of things that I went through that were very dangerous. And the only thing I can say about myself is being pretty lucky to come through Second World War. But I do think it was worthwhile for me to come through that World War II. I'm very, very lucky man.
Yes. There are pictures of you, Chester, in Korea as well, right?
Yeah.
So do you want to,
Well, not actually in Korea. He was called up for the Korean War.
okay.
That's not very interesting story. The Korean War, I was called back into the service. I was stationed at Pearl Harbor Naval Base. And all I did there for 1 whole year was working on different kinds of detail. But I enjoyed it very much.
Such a wide variety of service, from being in battle in one war to having a desk job, essentially, it sounds like, in the Korean War. But Chester is such a loyal citizen to go to a second war.
Yes.
Yes.
It was difficult for him, too.